Have you ever taken a shortcut, cut corners in your life, and then had the result blow up disastrously in your face? Have you ever rushed into a decision ahead of time or tried to force someone's hand only to have things go horribly and disastrously wrong? I think all of us in some measure suffer from impatience. We are all in our own various ways very quick to jump the gun, whether it be on a relational matter, jumping to conclusions, or doing something rash. Some of you might be very measured and calculated, and I do applaud you as someone who's maybe at times a bit impulsive. I could definitely learn from your example. But I don't think any of us are above having taken matters into our own hands when the right course would have been to have been patient, to wait, and to not force the issue. You learn this lesson through all areas of life, whether it be big areas or small. I mean, when you're getting into learning how to barbecue, for example, low and slow is always the best policy, and you're going to end up with some tough meat if you don't learn that lesson and allow things to play out carefully and cautiously. If you're a student and you do really well, you know the material, but you rush through the exam, you try to finish everything as quick as possible and take pride in being one of the first done, but end up with only average grades, you know the penalty that you may pay for not being cautious and not allowing things the proper time to unfold. Even in bigger areas of life, how many of us have jumped to a decision, made an investment, made a life change that we should have waited through prayer and through counsel to make? Or perhaps maybe we made the mistake of forcing the issue with the relationship, jumping into a bad situation that wasn't in the long run in your best interest. Or if not for you, others who suffered as well from maybe jumping into a marriage where they shouldn't have, or even just a dating relationship. These sorts of jumping to conclusions or rushing things or pressing too much or trying to force somebody else's hand when you should wait, that does play a factor also in our spiritual life and in our walk with Christ. As a young minister, I can clearly, or back when I was younger, I can tell you for sure, there were absolutely times where I might have jumped the gun, took on too much responsibility too soon, took on a role that I wasn't prepared for, or tried to give pastoral counseling in a situation where the wiser course would have been to trust in some more steady hands. Sometimes our ambitions can be too great, and we can cause problems when we force or when we attempt to force God's hand. And what's happening in our text this morning really is the story of our great forefather Abram and his wife Sarai jumping the gun in many senses. This is them making all the wrong choices. It's Abram and Sarai's greatest failure in the Old Testament. The story of them coming up with schemes and plots to try to seize for themselves, to take by force what God had promised to give them in the covenant that we read about last week. We've mentioned in the past that of all of the failures or so-called failures of Abram, whether or not other episodes were failures, that there was going to be one, that there is one really big failure of Abram, and we have hit that here in this text this morning in Genesis 16. We will encounter his major shortcomings, there's not a lot of ways we're going to be able to dice this. There are some ugly things in this passage, maybe even uglier than you might have thought upon first glance. There are things here which are unseemly, and definitely they don't comport well with our modern sensibilities or by any moral standard, by timeless moral standards. Some of the stuff here is ugly as well. We will deal with these issues frankly and truthfully, but we also see running through this entire episode a God who is loving, a God who cares, and a God who will care not just for the downcast, but will also take our very worst moments, the moments of great figures like Abram, and use them to accomplish his good purposes. All those things are wrapped up into this text, Genesis 16 today, And we will look at it under our customary three headings. The first of which is this, point number one, the schemes of Abram and Sarai. The schemes of Abram and Sarai. Well, the story this morning comes on the heels of that great event from Genesis 15, where God establishes, where he literally cuts a covenant with Abram. And God, after Abram fought that great battle and he won the unlikely battle to recover his nephew Lot and Lot's possessions, we read in 15 how God reaffirms the reward that is due to Abram for his faith, that God will promise to be his God, and God will promise him a righteousness, grants him a righteousness according to his faith. And God has promised to Abram that he will give him innumerable offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven. And God also promises to Abram that his offspring will come to inherit this particular place of land, the land of Canaan. So we get in chapter 15, this very high point in the story of Abram so far. Things are going well. Even though Abram is advanced in age, God is appearing to him, being faithful to him, reaffirming that his interest is with him. We go from that high point to this low point in a very short amount of time. Now, this episode, and it's the way that it depicts Abram and Sarai, there is no ambiguity in this representing this great moral failure, this great disaster of decisions that they embark in. If you recall, several weeks ago or months ago, because we took a pause, we looked at Abram's journey to Egypt when he goes to the Pharaoh, and there was some question there about his motives and who do we really lay the blame on? And could we say that that was really this example of Abram's immoral actions? In the text there, even though Abram was cunning and he was crafty, and he was being wise in his dealings, that text really places the blame of behavior on the Pharaoh. That it's Pharaoh who sees and seizes, who takes claim of Sarai, and that it's Pharaoh who's sinned in that instance. We go from there, though, to this one, which is, again, not ambiguous. There's no guesswork to be had, and we will see here in this story of Hagar, the story of Hagar and the birth of Abram's first natural-born son, Ishmael. We see in verse 1, it tells us very simply that Sarai, Abram's wife, still at this point, after God reaffirmed the promise, had borne him no children, but she was in possession of this female servant whose name was Hagar. The reason why I bring up that earlier Egyptian episode is because it seems pretty clear, and you can infer that Hagar was brought along with Abram and his household when they left Egypt. Because if you recall, after that episode, Abram leaves with his household enlarged. They take on more possessions as well as servants, and it's because of that Lot has to split off because the household had swelled so large. Hagar is an Egyptian. It's clearly not a Hebrew name. An Egyptian, and most of our translations, if not all of them, will just call her a servant. It refers to Sarai as her mistress. But don't be mistaken and don't be misled that the relationship between the two is between a master and a slave. Hagar has joined Abraham's house as a slave, and slavery, and the nature of slavery, what God thinks about slavery, the relationship between slave and master is something that is brought to the fore in this particular story, in this particular passage. We'll have more to say on that as the story unfolds. When the Bible does describe things, though, like we're going to see here, I want us to just point out before we even get into the nitty-gritty of what happens, it's important to note that just by simply describing what happens, and even describing how Abram and Sarai are behaving in ways that are similar to the other peoples at the time, the Bible is not giving a wholesale endorsement to some of what we will read. Abram and Sarai's actions are not condoned, even though they are reported to us. We see that, and it's important to be honest about that, as we see in verses 2 and 3 what are happening. Sarai, as we know, is advanced and aged. She's been promised an offspring by God, and that offspring has not arrived. And so Sarai it is here who takes the initiative to take matters into her own hands. She comes up with the first bit of this plan, this scheme. She tells Abram in verse 2, "Behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children." And so she invites him to go into her servant, her slave, that it may be that I may obtain children by her. If you just look at that language and you really put it to scrutiny, there are some things that should give you pause and make you reflect. What is she actually saying here? I mean, Sarai begins this story off on the wrong foot. There are no doubts about it. Because the first thing that she says, and the first thing that comes out of her mouth, is an expression of doubt in God. And actually, she doesn't just speak doubt, she also brings an accusation against the Lord. I mean, who does she lay the blame on? What does she say? The Lord has prevented me from bearing children. First clue that she brings this accusation. She then goes on to create this scheme by which to obtain for herself, by her own methods, by her own cunning, a way for her to possess a child, and that is to give her slave over to Abram and have them conceive a child. But also in that act, don't overlook what she is saying. She suggests that her husband take to himself a concubine, and to add to himself another wife. Now, even though we see lots of stories of polygamy in the Old Testament, and there are instances where men take on multiple wives, as we learned from the very beginning of Genesis and is reaffirmed later by Jesus, is that's not God's design or plan or what is necessarily good for us. It's not condoned. It's simply reporting what is. And though the practice would have been common outside of the people of Israel and at the time, again, it's not spoken of in a positive light, in particular in this story. Also, her complete ownership over and disregard for Sarai, which gets worse and worse as the story goes on, is first indicated here, because her complete ownership over Hagar as her property is seen here, because what is she going to lay claim to in this scheme? She wants Sarai to lay with her husband, but who will be in possession of the child? Sarai. So Hagar will lie with Abram, and Sarai will take possession of the child. It does represent a disregard for Hagar. It does show a disregard for God's promises, what he has promised and told Abram that he would give to this couple. And what we see in Sarai's first action in developing this plan is something, if you've been following along in the book of Genesis, it's something that we should be familiar with. That Sarai sees something, that she beholds something that God has promised to her, that God has held out for her, this hope in an offspring. And Sarai sees this as tempting and sees this as good, and her whole scheme is about her then seeking to take it, to grab what God has already promised, but to grab it by means that God has not permitted. She doesn't stop to receive the good things of God. And perhaps, if that doesn't ring a bell, of a wife or a woman seeing something and taking it that looked good to the eyes and taking hold of it before herself, Abram's reaction to her should indicate for us that this is indeed a story that is shining light on their errors or their sin and a fall or some sense for the two of them. It says in the response that Abram listened to the voice of his wife Sarai in this matter. Now, in practical terms, like, it's generally good advice for you men. So here's me. This is my little bit of marriage encouragement from the pulpit. Okay, listen to your wives. It's a good thing. But in the context of Genesis, Abram listening to his wife should make us think more about Adam than it does about an upright and a righteous husband. That she has come up with this scheme, she has presented this to him, and rather than standing firm in his faith in God's promise and rather than trusting in God to deliver all the things that he promised to him, Abram listens to the error of his wife and consents to this plan. The plan is for him to take on another wife, and he says, "Oh, okay, sure. Sounds like a good idea." No, this is, whenever we see this type of language, particularly in Genesis, it should hearken back to the fall in the garden. That's how we know to look upon this story in a negative light, because this is the same sort of thing playing out. Just as in that story, God had this promise held out to Adam, this promise of eternal life indicated by the tree of life, and they saw the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and were forbidden from doing that. The wife sees it, takes it, seizes it, and the husband shares in and endorses the sinful activity. It's the same sort of thing happening here. A man and a wife laying claim to God's promised reward that is for them, just as eternal life and the tree of life was set forth as a reward, and even the tree of knowledge of good and evil was good. It was God's design for Adam and Eve to be elevated in their wisdom and their discernment of good and evil. Just as then, when Adam and Eve took it by force, so too, Abram and Sarai are taking and laying claim to something ahead of time, taking something by force. And this action is what constitutes their biggest failure. Sin, in many ways, has entered the camp of the household of Abram and Sarai, and everything that happens is just going to be a compounding of problems that are going to result from this action and from this exercise of impatience, and quite frankly, this lack or this demonstration of a lack of faith. Abram, this great figure of faith, here in this moment clearly does falter. And as we know, in any case, when sin enters into a situation, there is fallout. And the one who pays the biggest price, therefore, in the story is Hagar. So the second thing I want us to see, point number 2, is the fallout and a flight. The fallout and a flight. Hagar is the collateral damage of the story, being a slave, being powerless in this particular situation. And we see that play out as the story goes on. Very straightforward and very simply, it tells us in verse 4 that Abram went into Sarai and she conceived. And when she saw that she conceived, she looked, we're told, at contempt upon her mistress. That she despised what the mistress had done, and by inference, it can be you can deduce that it's because this whole notion of giving over a child to your master and not being able to possess that child for oneself leads to this contempt and a rift that is created in verses 5 through 6, a rift between Abram and Sarai herself. And the reaction is disappointing. You can't sugarcoat it, the way in which they respond to this situation. There's nothing good about this. I mean, Sarai at first, obviously, she's mad. She's mad with Hagar for spoiling all of their plans, and for the contempt that has grown in her eyes. And she's upset with Abram, and she comes against her husband. So what had been unified, now they are at each other's throats. There's this division within the household. There's this rift in this relationship. She says to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you." So she curses her husband as a result of this. "I gave my servant or my slave to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." And it's kind of shocking because it's like, well, what did you expect would happen in this situation? This is, Hagar is a human, and they've mistreated her to use her as a pawn in order to bring about this result that God has already promised to them, but they're taking things into their own hands, and it's not going according to plan. And Abram, if anything here, his response is just as weak as when he consented to this whole thing in the beginning. He says in verse 6 that, behold, she's yours. She's your slave. She's your servant, and she's within your power. You handle it. You do with her as you please. He doesn't step in. He doesn't lead. He doesn't take initiative. He simply allows Sarai to handle the matter. And handle the matter she does, also in verse 6. It says that she dealt harshly with her and that Sarai fled from her. Now, the English is being nice to what Sarai did, because she dealt harshly with her slave as the Pharaoh and the Egyptians dealt harshly with the people of Israel as their slaves. That there's nothing nice about this. Sarai humbled her servant or her slave, Hagar. She afflicted. She abused her. She physically abused her in this particular case. And she punished her. And it's for that reason then that Hagar flees the scene, takes off from the household. This is all ugly. There's no way that you can get around this. If you invited a non-believer or your non-Christian friend to church Sunday morning and you told them we're going to learn a story about one of the greatest figures in the Christian faith, we're going to learn about one of our great forefathers, and then they step in this story. We have, polygamy and domestic abuse and violence, and there's slavery going on. They'd be like, "What the heck? What is this all about?" And quite frankly, what it should teach us and what it should show us is quite clearly like the destructive nature of sin. And it demonstrates to us what can happen when we lack patience, when we don't wait patiently for the Lord, when our faith and our devotion falters, we take matters into our own hands, and we can concoct schemes that are full of wickedness and deceit, and we see how the problem of sin can enter in and things can go from worse to worse. Now, obviously, some people claim that, when commenting on this passage and on this story, that what was happening here was pretty much commonplace in the ancient world. And Abram was a man of his times. Producing heirs via concubine or taking on additional wives, that was just common practice. That really what happened here. And obviously, and of course, holding slaves was acceptable and common, and treating them as the servants and the slaves that they were, that was completely acceptable. But Abram and Sarai, and we have to remember that the whole reason why Abram is in this land to begin with is not so that he would just step in and assimilate and be the same as everyone, and to behave like everyone, and to look no different. But Abram was called to maintain this distinctiveness. He was a sojourner and a wanderer. He wouldn't do things like he wouldn't accept the reward from the hand of the king of Sodom in that battle that we read about. They worshipped the one true God. There's something that's true of Abram and is true of all God's people, that we are all to be set apart and distinct, upright and moral in our character. That even as we sit here in this church, when you think about what we do here in church and what things we are concerned with, we're concerned with things that are spiritual and moral. In fact, the only authority that leaders in the church have is an authority over to you in terms of what you believe, your spiritual condition, and how you live morally. We have a spiritual and moral concern, and Abram here is not being diligent in the way that he conducts himself. There's also a lesson that we see clearly in this story, and it happens all over the Old Testament. What can go wrong when you try to grab something ahead of schedule? When you take something God has promised to you and you are told to wait faithfully for it and allow God to deliver it and to trust in him. And when you jump over the line of trust and you just take it by force ahead of time. Obviously, Eve in the garden, Abram and Sarai here. But even think of other stories like the people of Israel in the Exodus. When they get to Mount Sinai, they get impatient with Moses when he's meeting, and they just start worshiping God however they want by creating a golden calf. Or think about the people when they're picking a king. They don't wait. They don't heed God's warning. They just go and find the biggest, baddest dude and make him king because they want to take something by force. This is a great warning against such behavior. And to not consider God slow as some count slowness, is the way Paul or Peter put it in our reading from 2 Peter. That being a member of this household of faith does require a whole lot of waiting, as we see in the scriptures and as we have experienced firsthand. But yet where the story goes from this point forward and where things move isn't just focusing on that, but it also brings to light the very nature and the disposition of God, both God to fix and redeem these kind of situations, but it also shows us God's disposition towards the downcast, towards the lowest of society, towards people like Hagar, who takes up the remainder of this story. So the last thing I want us to see in point number 3, as we turn to Hagar, is point number 3, the angelic announcement. The angelic announcement. The second half of this narrative deals with Hagar. As she flees, we're told she goes into the desert. She's run away. She finds a little bit of water. And it is there that something truly amazing, and I don't think we consider how amazing it is, something amazing does happen. That this woman, so that's the first thing going against her in the ancient world. She's a woman. She's a slave. She's a runaway slave. She's pregnant. She's from a faraway land. She's from Egypt. She's a foreigner. This is someone who is perhaps at the lowest rung of society, flees, and God appears to her. In the same way that we've been looking at God's appearing to Abram over and over, we say this is really strange because when God promises things to Abram, he appears to him. We even went so far as to say that that God appears to Abram in the person of his son, that he appears to Abram in a way that is different from the father's appearing, where it's terrifying and no one could stand, but he appears in these other forms, the word of the Lord, or as a person, Yahweh, who can speak and talk with Abram face to face. Now he appears here again, the angel of the Lord, but he appears to Hagar, to this lowly runaway slave, Hagar. And he appears not just to send her back, which he does, which is important, but he also appears to show Hagar his great concern, his love, his care. And if you want to see something that's radically different from all of the religions at the time, you want to see something that's different from religions even today, we see the true character of our God, consistent both in Old and New Testament. The God who cares for the downcast and the least of these. When Jesus arrives preaching the message of the kingdom, he's not revealing something new about God. He's showing us the same God who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and has been consistent in the way that he deals with his people, even all the way back to the time of Abram in the book of Genesis. Hagar, servant of Sarai, he says in verse 8, where have you come from and where are you going? Like he doesn't know, but he's... And as he hears from her and as she engages with him and speaks to him face to face, he makes these amazing promises to her. I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And then he sings this song. Now, again, this should be something that when you hear, you pick up on. Behold, you are pregnant. You shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. You shall call his name Ishmael, which means God hears, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. So not only is this woman granted face-to-face visitation from God, she also has this blessing pronounced over her, and and God's promises that were made to Abram about fathering a great multitude of offspring is extended even to her. And he comes to this foreigner, this Egyptian woman, and wraps her into the promises made to Abram, and includes her in this great set of promises that Abram and Sarai were too impatient to wait for. Now Hagar has been incorporated into those same promises. This is all good news, and don't be confused by verse 12, which makes it sound like the angel's throwing shade at this son Ishmael, calling him a wild donkey of a man. Like we hear that, like, oh, that's crazy, and that is no. What's being communicated is that Ishmael is going to be like his father. He's going to be a wanderer. He's not going to have a fixed location. He's not going to be the father of like a great city or settle in one place. He's going to be this type of, he's going to live a nomadic existence, putting him at odds with others, having no fixed place, similar to the way Abram, his father, lives and exists. That's what's going on here. We're told in verse 13 that at that point she calls the name of the Lord. You are a God foreseeing, she said. Truly here I have seen him who looks after me. So she gets it. She knows. It's the angel of the Lord. No, she's seen God. She's been granted the privilege that very, very few, only Abram, have been granted, and that is to behold God in the person of his son face to face. Well, as the story concludes then, she returns because the angel has instructed her to go back. And she indeed does bear Abram a son, names him Ishmael. And from that point forward, we'll see where things go from here. But when they go back, then Ishmael is incorporated and included into the household of Abram. Now, one of the things, we're not going to get into it a ton here. I'll probably look at it more as Genesis continues. But one of the amazing things is that I think for us, particularly if you come from a background tradition like many of us have from Calvary chapels, you're used to reading these things only one particular way. And the promises to Abram being all about the people of Israel exclusively, and that the whole promise, the idea of Abram being the father of many nations, only comes about and is only fulfilled in our time, the New Testament church time, when other peoples from other nations come into the church. And in that sense, Father Abraham becomes a father to many nations, many types of people. And that's true. That is the great fulfillment. But there's also partial fulfillment happening in the book of Genesis or in the whole Torah. That Abram becoming a father of nations starts happening here. That there's going to be other people who have a direct lineage to Abram that come to take in the land of Canaan and are part of the story and have a role to play in all the happenings from here all the way till the conquest, even in Joshua. That Ishmael's descendants will remain in the land, and their inheriting parts of the land is part of this fulfillment of Abram being the father of many nations. We're going to see the same thing with Esau. That even though Esau separates, he's going to father people who will also trace their lineage to Abram, ultimately. That there's this interesting dynamic where there's this partial fulfillment that happens temporally in the story of the Pentateuch, and there's this grand, full fulfillment that happens later in Christ in the New Testament, in the New Covenant. So it's important to just note that, and that he's not just saying empty words to Hagar here. The promise is made that she will have offspring, that her son will father a nation that will be as numerous as a great multitude. That does come about, and they do take possession of part of Canaan. But quite clearly, and the thing I want us to land on and to finish up with here this morning, is that once again, as we've already stated, Christ himself appears to those who need him most. And that will extend all the way to the lowest people in society, like Hagar. But it also will happen to those who have blown it in major ways, like Abram and Sarai, as God's promise continues next week. There's a reason why their name changes after this. That as God comes to them and extends and grants them the covenant sign of circumcision and reaffirms them in the promises, that a shift has to take place with them. And it's a shift that comes as a result of the events of this story. But God, the one true God, from beginning to end, can make the worst even out of ungodly and unjust, ugly situations. That there is consolation for someone like Hagar. That there is grace in the character of God reserved for people like Abram and Sarai. When we read their story, and we do see very clearly a warning, the same kind of warning that we see in the garden against taking for ourselves good things that God has not yet given to us. Even though there is a warning against sinning, God will take even our worst decisions, our worst failures, and redeem them. And even in the process, while sin runs rampant and sin runs over people and destroys lives, there is hope that God will also restore the fortunes of those who suffer as collateral damage. That God's care and God's love for humanity extends to all people, both the great and the lowly, the least of these and great kings. I mean, this is a God. I mean, gods are served by kings and priests. Nobody out in the wilderness comes in contact with the one true God. And God doesn't go seeking them and make promises to them. We've fallen. When we do fall and stumble and commit sin and wander far from him, our God is a God who will not abandon us, will not abandon you, and will not abandon me. Christ has come to save us, to redeem us. And the general trajectory of the scriptures from beginning to end is a release from captivity, the captivity that holds us or our sinful flesh in bondage. And that is the captivity of sin. All of this, as we consider, quite frankly, both the good and the bad, the ugly, the horrific in these actions, but also the little bit of, or the great amount of hope and consolation that's offered in the appearing of God. May these things that take place not feel far from us, not seem remote to us, but may we receive this story from God's word as a very template for how to go about living before his face even now. Trust the Lord with your life. Trust to receive all of his promises in his timing, and even when we blow it, because we will, know that you're never so far off. You're never going to escape and run away from the love of God. You're never far away from God chasing you down, from Jesus showing himself to you once again in reaffirming all that he has promised regarding what he has for you and for your future.